It was a calm afternoon inside the mall. Bright lights reflected off the shiny floors, and the sound of quiet music floated through the air. Families walked from store to store carrying shopping bags, teenagers laughed near the food court, and children ran excitedly toward the ice cream stand. Everything felt normal, peaceful. Near the center of the mall, beside a small decorative fountain, an older man sat quietly on a bench. He wasn't trying to attract attention. Simple dark jacket, calm posture, hands resting together as he watched the crowd moving past him. To everyone around him, he looked like just another visitor taking a short break after shopping. People walked by without even noticing him. But across the hall, 2 security guards had just spotted him. They whispered to each other for a moment. Then both of them started walking directly toward the bench, their faces serious. At first, nobody paid attention. Mall security approaching someone wasn't unusual. But within the next few minutes, that normal afternoon was about to turn into something nobody expected. Because those guards had already decided that the quiet man sitting on that bench didn't belong there. And they were about to escort him out of the mall. What they didn't realize was that the man they were about to confront was not someone ordinary. In fact, the moment they reached him, the entire atmosphere of the mall would begin to change. And before long, the whole crowd would fall completely silent, because security had just walked up to Steven Seagal, and they had absolutely no idea. Before the story continues, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? And have you ever seen someone completely underestimated like this? The 2 security guards stopped directly in front of the bench. For a moment, the quiet man didn't even realize they were speaking to him. The mall was busy, and people were constantly moving around the fountain area. But then one of the guards cleared his throat loudly. "Sir," he said firmly. The man slowly lifted his head. His expression was calm, almost relaxed, as if nothing around him was bothering him at all. "Yes," he replied politely. The guard crossed his arms. "You can't sit here." The man looked around for a second, slightly confused. "I'm just resting," he said calmly. It was a simple response. Respectful, quiet. But the guard didn't seem satisfied. "This area isn't for loitering," the guard said sharply. "If you're not shopping, you'll need to move along." A few shoppers nearby slowed down when they heard the conversation. Nothing dramatic had happened yet, but something about the guard's tone felt unnecessarily aggressive. The man nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, but he didn't immediately stand up. He remained seated for another moment, still calm, still composed. That seemed to irritate the guards even more. The second guard stepped closer. "Did you hear what he said?" the guard asked in a louder voice. "You need to get up and leave." Now people were starting to notice. A young couple walking past paused near the fountain. 2 teenagers nearby whispered to each other while glancing over. Even a store employee leaned slightly out of a nearby shop to see what was happening. The man finally placed his hands on the bench and slowly stood up. There was no rush in his movements, no anger, no frustration, just patience. And something about that calmness made the situation feel strange. Most people would have argued by now. Most people would have shown irritation. But this man didn't react like that at all. Instead, he looked directly at the guard and said quietly, "I'm not causing any trouble." For a moment, the guards didn't respond. Then one of them sighed loudly. "Look, sir," he said, clearly annoyed, "we don't want to make this difficult. But we've already told you that you can't stay here." The second guard stepped even closer now. "You'll need to leave the building." The words were firm, and the tone made it sound less like a request and more like an order. People nearby had now completely stopped walking. Phones slowly began appearing in people's hands. Someone whispered, "Why are they bothering him?" Another shopper started recording the situation quietly. The man glanced around the mall for a moment. He noticed the people watching. The phones pointed toward them, but none of that seemed to bother him. Instead, he took a slow breath. Then he spoke again. "I'm just sitting here for a few minutes," he said calmly. But the guards had already made up their minds. One of them shook his head. "No, sir," he replied firmly. "You're leaving now." And with that, the guard reached forward and placed a hand on the man's arm. Not violently, but firmly enough that everyone nearby could see it. The moment that happened, the atmosphere around the fountain changed completely. Conversation stopped. People froze. Because now the situation had moved beyond simple words, and something about the quiet man's reaction made everyone watching feel uneasy. He didn't pull his arm away. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the guard, his expression still calm. But his eyes now carried a quiet warning, a warning the guards didn't notice. And as the guard tightened his grip slightly, preparing to escort the man toward the exit, The crowd had no idea that the situation was about to escalate in a way none of them expected, because the guards were about to push things one step too far. The moment the guard's hand tightened around the man's arm, the mood in the mall shifted. Only seconds ago, people had been walking past casually. Now many of them had stopped completely. Conversations faded, and the sound of footsteps slowed as shoppers turned their attention toward the scene near the fountain. Phones were now clearly visible. Several people were recording. The man remained calm. He looked down briefly at the guard's hand on his arm, then back up at the guard's face. His expression didn't show anger or fear. Instead, there was something almost patient about the way he stood there, like someone who had already seen situations like this many times before. "Sir," the guard said again, now speaking louder so the surrounding crowd could hear, "we asked you to leave." The man didn't pull away. He simply responded in a quiet voice, "I heard you." That calm response seemed to irritate the guards even more. The second guard stepped forward, clearly trying to take control of the situation. "Then let's not make this difficult," he said. "We're escorting you out." Around them, the crowd was growing. A mother holding her child paused nearby. A group of teenagers stood a few feet away, whispering while watching closely. Even some store employees had stepped out of their shops to see what was happening. Something about the man's calm presence made people curious. Most people in this situation would argue. Most people would try to defend themselves. But he didn't. Instead, he slowly straightened his posture. The guard still held his arm, but the man stood so calmly that the guard suddenly looked uncertain. "Let's go," the guard insisted. The man glanced briefly around the mall. Dozens of people were now watching. Phones pointed toward them from different angles. Then he spoke again. Still calm, still controlled. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing." The words weren't loud, but something about the way he said them made the air around them feel heavier. The guards exchanged a quick glance. Then one of them scoffed. "Oh yeah," the guard said sarcastically. "And why is that?" The man didn't answer right away. For a moment he simply looked at the guard holding his arm, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment, as if he had already tried to prevent what was about to happen. The guard shook his head impatiently. "All right, that's enough," he said, and he began guiding the man toward the mall exit. The movement caused the crowd to shift slightly as people stepped aside to make space. But the strange tension remained, because even though the guards seemed confident, the man they were escorting still looked completely unbothered. No panic, no resistance, just calm, and that calmness was making the entire crowd uneasy. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Why does he look so relaxed?" Another person murmured, "I feel like something's about to happen." The group slowly moved toward the glass entrance doors of the mall. Bright daylight poured through the large windows ahead. The guards continued walking, but just a few steps before reaching the doors, the man suddenly stopped. The guards turned toward him. "What now?" one of them asked impatiently. The man looked through the glass doors for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "I tried to stop you earlier," he said. "Not for me, but for you." The guards frowned in confusion. But before they could ask what he meant, something outside the mall caught everyone's attention. And in the next few seconds, the entire situation was about to change. Before we continue, what do you think is about to happen next? Comment below and let me know your guess. For a moment, no one moved. The guard stood there staring at the man, clearly irritated that he had stopped walking just a few steps from the exit. Behind them, a small crowd had already gathered. People who had been shopping minutes ago were now completely focused on what was happening. Phones were raised higher. Everyone was recording. "What do you mean by that?" one guard asked sharply. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked through the large glass doors at the front of the mall. Bright afternoon sunlight poured inside, reflecting off the polished floor. Then he slowly turned back toward the guards. His expression was still calm, composed. "Almost too calm for a situation like this," I said. He repeated quietly, "I tried to stop you earlier, not for me, but for you." The guards exchanged a quick look. One of them rolled his eyes. "Listen," the guard said impatiently. "We're not interested in whatever game you're playing." He tightened his grip slightly on the man's arm. "You were asked to leave. Now we're escorting you out." Several people in the crowd shifted nervously. Something about the situation felt strange. The man didn't struggle. He didn't even try to pull his arm away. Instead, he simply stood there, looking at the guard, almost as if he was giving him one last chance to reconsider. But the guard misunderstood the silence. To him it looked like stubbornness. "All right," the guard said firmly. "That's enough." He began pulling the man forward again toward the exit. The glass doors were only a few steps away now. The crowd parted slightly as they approached. Whispers spread quietly among the onlookers. Why is he so calm? Something about this feels weird. Who is that guy? The man walked beside the guards without resistance. Still silent, still calm. But just before reaching the doors, he paused again. This time he didn't stop suddenly. He simply slowed down. Then he turned his head toward the entrance once more. And that's when the first person in the crowd noticed something. "Hey, look outside," someone whispered. Several heads turned toward the glass doors. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Cars moved through the parking lot as usual. People walked past the entrance. But then something changed. A black SUV turned into the front driveway of the mall. Then another one, and another. The vehicles moved slowly but with purpose. Their dark windows reflected the sunlight as they pulled closer to the entrance. People near the door stepped aside in confusion. Inside the mall, murmurs spread through the crowd. Why are there so many SUVs? Is someone important arriving? The guards noticed the vehicles too. For a brief moment, their attention shifted outside, but they quickly dismissed it. "Come on," one of them said, turning back to the man. "We're done with this." But the man didn't look worried. In fact, he looked almost unsurprised, like he had expected this moment. The SUVs stopped directly outside the entrance. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Several men stepped out, dark suits, serious expressions, their movements quick and controlled. The crowd inside the mall began whispering louder now. Phones pointed toward the entrance. Because the men weren't just entering the mall casually, they were walking in with purpose, fast, focused, and their eyes were locked on one person. The quiet man standing between the two guards. Inside the mall, the atmosphere shifted completely. Even the guards began to notice the sudden tension in the air. "What's going on?" one of them muttered under his breath. The suited men reached the glass doors. They pushed them open and stepped inside. Their footsteps echoed across the floor as they moved forward. Straight toward the guards, straight toward the man, and suddenly, everyone in the mall realized something big was about to happen. The moment the glass doors opened, the entire atmosphere inside the mall changed. A cool wave of air drifted in from outside as the suited men stepped through the entrance. Their movements were calm but purposeful. They weren't looking around the mall like normal visitors. Their eyes were fixed on one direction, straight ahead, straight toward the quiet man standing between the two security guards. People in the crowd immediately sensed something unusual. Whispers spread quickly. "Who are those guys? Are they police? Something serious is happening." Phones lifted even higher now as shoppers tried to capture every moment. The guards noticed the men approaching, but at first they didn't seem concerned. Malls saw important visitors all the time, businessmen, politicians, even celebrities. But the way these men walked was different. Focused, confident, and completely serious. Within seconds, they were only a few steps away. The guards instinctively straightened their posture. One of them raised a hand slightly, trying to stop the men before they got too close. "Gentlemen, can we help you?" the guard asked cautiously. But the men didn't slow down. They walked directly past him. Their attention remained on the older man, the quiet man who had been sitting peacefully on a bench only minutes earlier. The crowd fell even quieter. Even the guards began to look confused. One of the suited men stepped forward slightly ahead of the others. He looked at the older man carefully, almost like he was checking to make sure he was all right. Then he spoke, his voice calm but carrying a tone of authority that immediately caught everyone's attention. "Sir, are you okay?" The guards blinked in surprise. "Sir." They looked back and forth between the man and the suited group. The quiet man nodded slightly. "I'm fine," he replied calmly. But the moment he spoke, something strange happened. Several people in the crowd gasped quietly. A woman near the fountain whispered to her friend, "Wait, I think I know who that is." Another shopper leaned forward, squinting slightly. "Hold on, that looks like." Phones lifted higher. More people began recording. The guards were starting to feel uncomfortable now. Something about the situation was shifting quickly, and they weren't sure why. The guard who'd been holding the man's arm slowly loosened his grip. Not intentionally, just instinctively, because the tension around them had suddenly changed. The suited man stepped a little closer. He glanced briefly at the guards, his expression serious. Then he turned his attention back to the quiet man. "Did they give you any trouble?" he asked. The question made the guards freeze. Now the entire crowd was watching closely. The quiet man looked at the guards for a moment. His expression remained calm. He didn't look angry. He didn't look upset. Instead, he simply sighed softly. "They were just doing their job," he said. The crowd murmured again, because that calm response didn't match the tension everyone else was feeling. But the suited men clearly recognized him. And now the guards were beginning to realize that something was very wrong. Very wrong. One of the guards finally spoke. His voice suddenly much less confident than before. Excuse me," he said, looking at the suited man. "Who exactly is this gentleman?" The suited man slowly turned toward the guards. For a brief moment he studied them. Then he answered calmly, and the moment those words were spoken, the entire mall was about to understand exactly what had just happened. For a moment, the mall felt completely silent. The guard who had asked the question stood stiffly, waiting for an answer. People in the crowd leaned forward slightly, trying to hear what the suited man would say next. The suited man looked at the guards calmly. Then he spoke. "You really don't recognize him." The guards glanced at each other awkwardly. They shook their heads. The suited man turned slightly toward the quiet older man standing beside them. For a brief second, the expression on his face softened with respect. Then he answered clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This is Mr. Steven Seagal." The words seemed to ripple through the crowd. Several people gasped. Phones immediately lifted higher as whispers spread rapidly through the mall. "Did he just say Steven Seagal? No way, that's actually him. I knew he looked familiar!" Within seconds, recognition began spreading from person to person like a wave. The calm man the guards had been trying to escort out of the mall was suddenly no longer just an ordinary visitor. He was Steven Seagal, the famous martial artist and action movie star known around the world. The guards froze. The confident expressions they had earlier disappeared instantly. The guard who had been holding Seagal's arm quickly pulled his hand back, stepping away slightly. His face turned pale. I'm sorry," he said nervously. The second guard looked equally shocked. Only minutes earlier, they had spoken to him as if he didn't belong in the building. Now the entire crowd was watching them, recording them, and realizing exactly what had happened. The suited man glanced at the guards again, his voice calm but firm. "You should be more careful about how you treat people," he said. The guards nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, of course," one of them replied. Steven Seagal himself still looked completely calm. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't shown anger. Instead, he simply looked at the guards for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. "It's all right," he said quietly. "They were just doing their job." The crowd murmured again, because most people expected a very different reaction. But Seagal didn't seem interested in embarrassing them. The suited men stepped slightly closer around him, clearly making sure the situation was under control. The tension that had filled the mall moments earlier slowly began fading. People started whispering excitedly. Some were smiling. Others were still recording, amazed that they had just witnessed the moment. The guards stood awkwardly to the side, clearly embarrassed. They hadn't intended to cause a scene, but their mistake had now become the center of attention in the entire mall. Steven Seagal glanced around briefly at the crowd watching. Then he spoke one more time calmly. "Next time," he said, looking at the guards, "just remember that respect shouldn't depend on who someone is. It should be given to everyone." The guards nodded quietly. The message was clear, and everyone listening understood it. Seagal gave another small nod to the suited men beside him. Then he calmly began walking toward the exit. The crowd slowly parted to make space for him as he passed. Phones were still recording. People whispered to each other in disbelief. Because what had started as a simple misunderstanding had turned into a moment nobody expected to see that day. And for the guards, it was a lesson they would never forget. What would you have done if you were standing there watching this happen? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. For a few moments after Steven Seagal began walking toward the exit, the mall remained unusually quiet. The tension that had filled the air earlier was slowly fading, but people were still standing in place, watching the scene unfold. Some shoppers whispered excitedly to each other. Others were still holding their phones up, recording the moment as it happened. It wasn't every day that something like this took place in the middle of a normal shopping afternoon. The suited men walked beside Seagal calmly, making sure the path ahead remained clear. But Seagal himself didn't seem interested in attention. His steps were slow and relaxed, just like they had been when he first entered the mall earlier. As he passed the crowd, people moved aside respectfully. A few quietly greeted him. One teenager whispered to his friend, "I can't believe that was actually Steven Seagal." Another person said softly, "He handled that better than most people would." Behind them, the two security guards were still standing near the entrance. They looked embarrassed. Moments earlier, they had been confident that they were simply doing their job. But now they realized something important. The way they had treated the quiet man had been based on an assumption. They had looked at his simple appearance and quickly decided he didn't belong. And that mistake had been made in front of an entire crowd. One of the guards finally took a slow breath. "You know," he said quietly to his partner, "that could have gone a lot worse." The second guard nodded. "Yeah," he replied. He could have made a big deal about it. But Steven Seagal hadn't done that. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't tried to embarrass anyone. Instead, he had simply responded with calmness and respect, and that reaction had left a stronger impression on everyone watching. Near the fountain, several shoppers were still discussing what had happened. "It's crazy how calm he stayed," someone said. "Most people would have argued immediately." Another person added, "That's probably why he handled it so well. Because sometimes the strongest reaction isn't anger. Sometimes it's control." By the time Seagal reached the mall doors, the atmosphere inside had completely changed. The tension from earlier had turned into something else. Respect. The guards watched quietly as he stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight. The black SUVs were still parked near the entrance. But before getting into one of the vehicles, Seagal paused for a moment. He turned back briefly toward the mall. Toward the crowd watching through the glass doors. He didn't say anything more. He simply gave a small nod. Then he stepped into the vehicle. The door closed, and the SUVs slowly pulled away from the entrance. Inside the mall, people finally began returning to their shopping. Conversations resumed. Footsteps filled the hallway again. But many of the people who had witnessed the moment knew they had just seen something memorable. Not because of a confrontation, but because of the lesson behind it. You never truly know who someone is. And the way you treat people says more about you than it does about them. Respect should never depend on someone's fame, appearance, or status. It should be something we give to every person we meet. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one everyone eventually recognizes. If you believe everyone deserves respect no matter who they are, type RESPT in the comments below.